So I truly believe, regardless of how hard it is, that timing was divine in a bit. He knew what he was doing. I didn't really understand it at the time, but it makes sense now that he wanted me there going through that at that time.
Hey everybody, and welcome back to Wednesdays with Watson. I am so excited that you are continuing to join us on our journey, Season 3, Trauma, Spaces, Places, and Aces. We have spent the last 6 episodes taking a deep dive into learning how God made us and how that can help us as we process trauma. We are doing that using an effective tool called the Enneagram, and we have landed on Type 7. As I have dubbed the Good Time Charlies. Today here with me, as well as my co-host Crissy is my friend Angie D. And Angie is here to talk to us about how she has processed some trauma, as well as understanding how God made her by using this tool of the Enneagram. Before we welcome in Angie to the show, I would love to welcome in my co-host, Crissy Lothridge. How you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing good.
Good. So let's just drop right into this episode and go for it.
I would like to ask, what is your favorite thing about how God made you?
Yeah, so that's a tough one because I don't like talking about myself, but I guess I'm going to have to do that during this entire podcast, right? Let's make this about God, though. It'll make me feel better. He gave me a very adventurous spirit. So I'm like a kid in a candy store most of the time. Always planning my next trip, can have pretty much fun anywhere, doing anything. Will always try anything once kind of person. So yeah, if I had to choose one thing, I would say that's my favorite thing about how he made me.
I think I told you recently, because you do have a lot of fun, and sevens, Enneagram sevens, just love them some fun, and they're favorites in some ways. But I told you on Instagram recently when you were posting on trips, because you'll just like get on an airplane and go by yourself, that you can take these really pretty pictures of places. And I remember telling you, nobody likes you very much right now. But I love that about you as well. I think that is such a beautiful way that God made you. And everyone, by the way, has struggled to answer that question. And I'm going to have to answer it too. And I have no idea what I'm going to say. But I do want to dig right in, because people come to this podcast to learn. And this part of this Season 3, Trauma, Spaces, Places, and Aces, is about an ace. And again, I want to really stress that I do not believe that we are our Enneagram number, that our identity comes in Christ. But I think that there is so much to be said for learning about how God made us and what we're afraid of, what motivates us, and all of the things. And so, Angie, the core fear / motivation. And so for any listeners who have just kind of stumbled on to 7 and don't really know or understand what a core fear / motivation is, that is basically what we're trying to run from / what we are longing for. And so for the Enneagram 7, the thing that they try to run from the most is feeling deprived, limited, trapped, and especially trapped in emotional pain. And so, Angie, I'm just curious, when you heard that, and you had done some research on the Enneagram yourself, but Carissa Harrison was on the season finale of Season 2, and she talked about it. How did this resonate with you as an Enneagram 7?
Yeah, so the fear of being trapped in emotional pain, I definitely can resonate with that. But I mean, who wants to be trapped in emotional pain though, right? Especially if you've been through trauma. I doubt if you ask anyone that question that they would say, yeah, I love that. But I think that I have experienced that fear on deeper levels at times, which has led to some very unhealthy methods of dealing with pain rather than going through it and processing it. So yeah, but I think I'll have to go into a bit more of my story, or tell our listeners a bit more about myself in order to dig a little deeper into that question. and it's actually kind of a cool story because I did go from doing anything that I could to escape pain, to learning to sit with it and process it, still learning which in the Enneagram world would mean that I went from an unhealthy 7, right, to a more healthy 7. So it's kind of a cool story.
Yeah, so it's actually a great transition. So Angie, you and I met at a Women's Night of Worship event at really all 3 of our home church at Calvary and Clearwater. And you immediately, I was on a panel. I had the opportunity to be on a panel about mental health and trauma, particularly as it pertains to, I was going to say the middle of the pandemic, but who knows when that actually is. No one knows where we are in that. But then you and I were able to meet for dinner a couple of weeks later. And you had shared with me that you had some significant loss and trauma in your life. As you also know, because you stumbled on this podcast from a friend who gave it to you, this podcast is about trauma. And I think particularly for the 7s who fear this being trapped in emotional pain, but without the tools to do anything about it, I think is something that we really should sit with just for a second. Can you share with us a little, and please as little or as much as you want, about your trauma and loss? Because I think the delineation of some of the decisions you made as a result of understanding that you were unhealthy is important. But I think setting that scene for our listeners is really important. So share a little bit about trauma and loss, and I'll kind of interject here every now and then if I think that you have hit on something that I know our listeners can resound with. But I would love to give you the space to talk to our listeners, and to Crissy for the first time for hearing this, about your trauma, loss, and pain.
Sure. So some of my trauma, or I guess what we could say the source of my trauma, involved people that I love and by God's grace are still in my life, and we have been strengthening our relationships over the past few years. So I do want to respect that and not go into too many details, but I can say what I do want to say is that from a very young age, I was made to feel worthless, unwanted. I don't even know if made to feel is the right way to say it, but just things in my life made me feel that way. That's the message that I got, right? Which really, and it's cool that you hit on identity a little earlier, because it really led to me looking for my identity in anything other than Christ, especially looking for my identity in relationships. We want to talk more recent, in the Enneagram 7 and going on trips to escape pain. Since this is a trauma podcast, we all know that unhealthy people will not typically be with healthy people, right? So when I say I turn to relationships, I really, from a younger age, started dating men and was with men that I should not have been with. And because of that, more trauma occurred. So I was just kind of compounding the trauma, and I would no sooner finally get out of a relationship than to have more trauma, that compounded pain, and then run to another relationship to not sit with that pain. And it was this very unhealthy cycle for years and years and years.
Yeah, so I think what's really interesting about that, and what I want listeners to hear, right, because this is, like you said, a podcast about trauma, and it is also these first 9 weeks, we are studying who God made us, and really the Enneagram has been the best for me as it pertains to healing from trauma. And so for those of you 7s out there, probably just resonated a lot with what Angie said, in that she escaped that emotional pain from significant childhood and adult, and really maybe even ongoing, as we all have, trauma by relationships, by people, by going on trips. Not that there's anything wrong with that. We all know and love 7s. I mean, like, I call them good time Charlies because I really believe that that's what they are. But
we are.
You absolutely are. It's the ones we want to call when it's time to plan something and all the things. There had to have come a point, because I remember sitting with you at dinner that night, and you were telling me, and I didn't realize until last night that how recent it was when you and I were sitting in one of our favorite little towns in the west coast of Florida, having some appetizers and a glass of wine. I did not realize how fresh that was. But at some point you realized, and I would love for you to tell the listeners what the impotence was of that. Like, this is not okay. I need help, because we talk about counseling a lot on this podcast. What was the impotence for that?
Well, so I'm 38 now. So, and that was a few years ago. It wasn't until a few years ago that I actually learned to sit with the pain and process through it. So I can kind of talk you through that story. First, let me give our listeners some encouragement to say that if you resonate with that, or with my story, or with the fear of being trapped, and you're not used to processing through pain in a healthy way, that it's hard and it takes time. And it is like a never ending process and battle, but if you put in the work, it'll be worth it. So like I said, I'm 38. So let me also take another second here to point to the star of our story, Jesus, because that's really what led me to seeking help and learning to sit with the pain, was him. I was raised in a church. I've always been a believer, but it wasn't until about 10 years ago that I was actually saved and gave my life over to Christ, and my whole heart to him. And since then, so again, this is a long process. And since then, he started working on my heart little by little. And he started showing me how loved I am and was, and that he wanted better for me. So it was actually him that pointed out little by little these unhealthy habits that I had. And again, little by little, keep wanting to say that, because that's what it's been. It's been a journey. But a little over 2 years ago, and after yet another relationship, this time it was definitely more healthy than previous relationships, because Jesus, but still not where God wanted me to be. He kind of brought me to my breaking point after that. And I said, this is enough. I want to process through this. I want to run to God instead of another man, instead of going on these trips. So I started by searching for Christian counselors then. And one of my dear friends from church put me in touch with a counselor. She was actually in another state. So I had a few sessions with her on the phone, and she said, I think it'd be best if you came down to do an intensive, which for those of you that may not know what that is, it's like several days and hours of counseling. It's like nonstop. It's intense. So I did. I flew to another state, paid a lot of money, went to see her. It was hard. She made me process my trauma. She did exercises with me. We did the EMDR. She literally made me draw with colored pencils every single traumatic experience. That's the trauma egg that I could remember. She gave me like this big poster board, and I flipped it over. She was just like, oh my goodness, because I drew all over the front and all over the back. So it was hard. It was really hard. That was the first time that I really, really sat with the pain with her. And during that session and during my EMDR sessions, there was just this pattern that came up of her recognizing that I never sat with pain, even with, deaths. We'll go so far as to say with deaths in the family or people I loved, I never fully grieved. That came up a lot. So it was really, really eye-opening and really healing.
I'm just curious. One thing that really resonated with me that you said is it's little by little. and really, I know you said this and I know you emphasized it. I'm just going to emphasize it again because it's little by little, and it's those days when it's like, this is so hard to sit in this pain. Keep going. Don't give up. To all the listeners out there, it is a hard work to really start the healing journey, but it is so worth it. My question is, in my personality, I live in a lot of regret. And so I'm curious, with a type 7, is there a lot of regret and shame hitting you, like, oh, how did I keep going in circles for so long? Or is that not a hallmark of the 7s? You guys kind of move forward and that was the past and I'm on. Or what resonates more with you?
So at first there was a lot of shame, a lot of shame from my diagnosis of CPTSD, a lot of shame from, like you said, going back and being like, wow, I am 30 some years old and I did this my entire life. But Jesus, I have to look to him. And I know that sounds cliche and all that, but it's just so true. And through this process, he has just showed me so many beautiful things and just brought me through, and so I really do have to turn to him to wipe away that shame and that regret. And I really do have to think, I wouldn't be, and again, I know this sounds cliche, but it's so true, that I wouldn't be the person I am today had I not went through that. I do not wish that upon anyone, but I can be on this podcast now. I can be talking to people, I can relate to people, especially women. I have such a heart for women that turn to relationships and things like that. And I wouldn't be able to do that. So yes, I do. I have shame and regret, and that's a constant battle. But if I constantly turn to that and to God, it helps.
Same here. It's that constant reminder of the Lord is using this, even though I still feel that same sense of, ugh, why did I do that? But the reminder that God uses all of it, and it is shaping us into who we are now. It at least helps push away that shame and regret for me.
Yeah, and that's the thing that is important to highlight here, because as Angie just so beautifully described to us, a life before she made the decision to live in the hard, right? So if you're an Enneagram 7, even though you really, really, really hate being trapped in emotional pain, oftentimes you will still do that because that's the less hard of the two. Angie, what you did, and I know a little bit about this. I know a little bit about this one sitting next to me right here who said, you can come live with me. And I said, well, how much rent would I pay? And she said, the only expectation is that you go to counseling, which is still by far one of the hardest things that I've ever done in my life. But those listeners out there, I know that it costs money. We attempt to raise money on this podcast for those of you who can't afford it. I know it's hard. I have gone to my counselor and talked about the weather. I have done all the hard stuff. But if we don't want shame to win, shame's game is to take us down and to make us feel like crap 100% of the time, 24/7, 365. And Angie, it's interesting that you mentioned that you felt a little bit of shame when you got diagnosed with CPTSD. I remember sitting in the ER before they put me into the psych ward, and the doctor was like, yeah, you have PTSD. And I was like, whatever. I wouldn't accept it because that seemed defective to me. That seemed like I was even more broken than I already was. And I'm not an Enneagram. I'm a 2, but I go into an 8 in unhealth, and I had lived a good majority of my life into an 8, and then winging into the 3. It was all about doing, performing until I ran into a wall. And as I've said on a couple podcasts in this series, I'm not Roadrunner. So when I ran into the wall, I about died. really, quite honestly, about diet. And so for those of you out there who are sevens, I promise you, and I think Angie would agree, that the level of hard of getting help is significantly less than the level of hard of being trapped in this emotional pain. Would you agree with that, Angie?
Yeah, I mean, maybe not at first, because it is hard. It is, because you are sitting in the pain when you get help, right? So it's kind of the same. But how you feel afterwards, and again, I don't want to say, oh, you're going to be fully healed and all that, but just that, especially like for me, that weight off my shoulder of like, yes, I am going to break this cycle, and that understanding of what it's like and what it feels like, how to do it, to truly sit with the pain. There's just something so redeeming about that.
You've said this so many times, and we have a question for you as it pertains to recent past. But I just want to say, before Crissy jumps in here with one of her favorite questions, is you keep using that term, sitting with the pain. And I can't think of fewer, more powerful words than that, because it's very similar to just deciding to eat your vegetables when you're little, or even now as an adult. We know that we don't like it. Like, if you give me Brussels sprouts, I'm going to be angry. But those things nourish us. And so deciding to sit in the pain, Angie, I can't look at you because you're my friend. Deciding to sit in the pain is so powerful and so admirable. I just wanted to say that.
You're sweet.
I remember, when you first moved in with me and started really going into counseling, I was like, great, smooth sailing from here on out. She's in counseling. And it got so much worse, and I was shocked. And so for those of you out there, if you start going to counseling, I think that's a good point that you made. It is really hard at first, but the end result really is worth it. Again, hang in there. It is really, really worth it, but it is intensely hard. And in some ways, at the very beginning, it's worse before it gets better. Like they say, it's darkest before the dawn type of thing. But please don't give up.
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, I was in her, and I wanted to run still when I was down there. When I was in this other state, for the counseling, I wanted to. There were times when in her office where I would even just shut down, and I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I would almost, that's part of the PTSD too. But also, I mean, even if you don't have PTSD, just talking through things and your pain and processing things. I literally, after a while, a couple of times, just would shut down. That's how hard it was. I felt it in my body. And so yeah, it's hard all the way around. It's hard.
Tell me how the last 20 months or so have been for those of you who are Enneagram 7s.
And before we do that, Crissy, if I'm correct, you were referring to the how has COVID-19 been for you? And then Angie, I want to couple that with my realization last night that these two things, where you decided to go to the hard and COVID-19 hit, really kind of merged. So talk to us about how this has been not only for you, but sevens, listen, because you probably have experienced the pandemic in a similar way. And so that's why we're asking that question. But I want to make sure I highlight here that, Angie, this was like 3 months after going and filling up a poster board with your trauma and deciding to go to the hard, and then boom, like you were probably like, yay, I can go on trips for a healthy and the world said nope. So yeah, talk to us about the last 20 months.
Yeah, it was very close to that. And I guess I wasn't, though, Amy, I wasn't like, yay, I can go on trips and that now, because I wanted to be, but I knew that I still had to sit to process more. It wasn't those few days in counseling and then I was done to do sessions, and I wanted to, and I made a promise to myself and to God, like especially with relationships, I'm taking at least a year off from dating anyone. And I just want to sit and process through things and draw closer to God. And so, yeah, it is very interesting too that that was hard to do. Let me just say again, that was very hard to even make that decision. And then to be obedient to that was super hard. And then, yeah, a few months later, the pandemic. So how in general as an Enneagram 7 to have a pandemic is crazy. You know, we always want to be going on trips and all that. So it's hard in general for us to sit still. And the timing though, because there's the pandemic and then I just got back from counseling and all that. I actually had just, called it off with the guy that I was with before I went to counseling. So I was also going through a breakup. So there were a lot of things. And then that pandemic, and it's like, okay, so talk about being forced to kind of sit with pain then. So it did, I think it made it so much harder, and it was lonely. But at the same time, it was this sweet time with God and the sweet time with girlfriends. We did quarantine, and I hate to even use that word, but we would go on walks outside and just talk. That's all we had to do was to go on walks. So it was really helpful for me too, that everyone else was slowing down. So it really helped to have friends and community that were slowing down to talk to. So I truly believe, regardless of how hard it is, that timing was divine in a bit. He knew what he was doing. I didn't really understand it at the time, but it makes sense now that he wanted me there going through that at that time.
I was going to ask, what are some of the things that you did as a 7, and you answered it partially. You went on walks with friends, and what did you do to try to stay as true to your, I assume, outgoing, adventurous self as you could within the confines of
stay home,
at least probably community, at least having stopping the alone factor. And it sounds like you found some walk outside with friends, and probably a lot more texting and calls. Or do you have any other things that really stand out that were helpful for you?
Yeah, I was outside a lot. And so I live in Florida. We live in Florida. There was a lot to do during that time. There's a lot to do outside. So I did things like I bought rollerblades, man, and I can't really rollerblade for the life of me, but I learned how. I fell a few times. I'm good. I got the pads and all that. I did that, stuff like that. Bought a hammock and would just go to random places and just hang my hammock and have time with Jesus and reading, and got a bike. So this, I still really was, I think that was when I got my paddle board too. So a lot of cool things that I did, that I did while I was just here in town. And now I still do, because I bought all that stuff during that time. But yeah, I got pretty creative. So.
Well, yeah, lots of hammock time for me. I'm not a 7, but I am an extrovert, and extroverts were not okay. And particularly, I do want to say, as your friend, how proud I am of you that you continue to stay with what you had gained and then intensive counseling. I do remember that the darkest nights were after that time when, for me, I ended up in a psych ward for 5 days, but the darkest days were after that, as Crissy just talked about. And so to have gone through, did the work that you did, which is opposite of what an Enneagram type 7 wants to do, and then to walk into isolation where you were just there with your thoughts. And we all, I've worked from home my whole career, but not everyone did. And so for an Enneagram 7 to not have that social interaction and all the things, I think is really important. But I just can't highlight here. Normally we actually ask a question, but Angie has really interwoven this all the way through this podcast interview of how how understanding how God made her has enriched her relationship with him. I know though, Angie, that other people out there who are not necessarily Enneagram 7s, but for those of us who love you, and I am honored to be one of those people who love you, but what don't we know? How can we love you better? What do you wish the world knew about the Enneagram type 7?
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to that sitting with the pain thing, because, and this is good for listeners to hear too, regardless of what work you do. Again, I don't know if we're ever fully healed from it. It is a constant battle. So, to those that love me, I would want them to know that it's hard for me not to run at times, especially with the PTSD, combined with being a 7. You just look out if I start to veer towards the unhealthy. So it'll be hard for me not to run at times, but rather stay and sit with the pain. And in relationships too, that means kind of in conflict or in anything, actually talking through things and sitting there. And so although God healed me in so many ways and in that area so much, there will still be at times that gut reaction where I want to run, or it'll be hard for me to talk through something difficult. So I would say know that and be patient with me and love me still, because I need that, and I need Jesus to kind of flip that switch over to healthy sometimes.
I love that so much. And I love, as I mentioned, being somebody who loves you as an Enneagram 7, being someone who loves you with PTSD, being someone who loves you with CPTSD. And there is a delineation there. And Angie and I both share that in the complex post-traumatic stress disorder. For those of you who kind of want to know what that is, that just means that trauma has been layered on top of each other, and it exhibits itself in complex ways that doctors don't understand. And so when you're talking about an Enneagram 7, here's what I do for Angie. Angie is on a list of people, and it's a short list of people that if I don't hear from her within a given amount of time, I will text her, because I want to pull her out of a cave if that's where she is. Now, lately she's just been texting me pictures from Arizona and the Bahamas and all kinds of places, but but check on your strong friends, check on your 7s. I think 7s are some of the strongest friends. And I don't mean strong like strength, like
they look like they're doing great.
Yeah, they look, that's a great point, Crissy. They look like they're doing great. So when I use that term a lot, check on your strong friends, but especially check on your 7s, especially check on your 7s. One thing that I do want to say, not only to Angie, but to every 7 out there, what Angie has walked us through today is your worst nightmare going into the hard. You have 2 choices: to continue to run from that fear of being trapped in the pain. And Angie has brought up, I went on trips, I indulged in relationships that I shouldn't have been on. But understand that for a type 7, when you are trying to run from that being trapped in emotional pain, that can look like anything. That can look like substance abuse. It can look like overeating. You can shop too much. You can have codependent relationships. Most 7s, if God made you this way, when it comes time for you to pick harder, so hard is running from the pain and harder is getting help from the pain, it's going to be hard for you to pick the harder, but I promise you there's such freedom in that. I know that it's hard though, but I do want to remind you of a couple things. In Psalm 147:3, and Angie, this is my message to you, and this is my message to all 7s out there. This is his promise to you. Psalm 147:3 says, he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds. And Angie, you're living that in real time. Psalm 56:8, another one of my favorite, as you keep track of all of our sorrows and you have collected all of our tears. And so I promise you out there, regardless of whether you identify as a type 7 or not, if you can not take anything from this episode besides the star of the story, and again, I've mentioned in every podcast, if you don't know Jesus as your personal savior, you have no idea what we're talking about. I would love it if you would just open your podcast app and hit that contact Amy, and I will help you. I will introduce you to the star of the story. I will most likely send you to someone better than me at that, but I will tell you about my Jesus, because he is the only reason why I can be behind this microphone. It's the only reason why Angie can be on this podcast. because at some point, I don't give myself credit for much, but at some point I decided to do the same thing that Angie did, as I decided I didn't want to live like this anymore, and I decided to get help. And it is not easy. Trauma is going to be there unless God decides to take it from us. But there will be a day, guys, there will be a day when we are in heaven, and every knee will bow and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. And I love that part. I can't wait for that part, and how many billions of years I will be like that Mercy Me song, will I dance for you, Jesus, or will I bow at your feet? But I know that the rest of the time I'm going to enjoy no more tears, no more suffering, no more pain, and just walking on streets of gold, and just spending time with the star of the story, who does all things well and who continues to make all things new. And Angie's got some cool things going on in her life that we're not going to put in a public forum as a result of her healing. But I am so proud of you. And the last word is yours, my friend, as we near the podcast here. What else would you like, if anything, to say to our listeners?
I guess I would just say, I think you covered it just now, Amy, pointing to the star of the story, that if it weren't for Jesus, I would not have even really recognized to the extent of my pain and my suffering and that cycle and needing to get help. And if it weren't for him, I definitely don't know if I would have been able to get through all of that, all of the sitting with the pain and all of that. And I know that might sound a little weird, especially if people don't know him. It would to me if I didn't. But I do hope that y'all reach out to Amy if you do want to get to know him, and she can point you in the right direction, which is towards him or someone that she said that may be better. You are just fine at that, Amy, at telling people about Jesus. So yeah, I think that's what I would tell people.
Well, I just want to thank you for being here today. And I want to thank you for your friendship. And I'm so grateful for what the Lord is doing in your life. I'm grateful that you are yourself living out, as everyone who has listened to my podcast knows, one of my favorite verses, Joel 2:25, where he promises to restore all the years that the locusts have stolen. And just as we mentioned at the very beginning of this series, listeners out there, you're listening to the years, that the redemption of the years that the locusts have stolen, not only in my life, but in Angie's life, and even in Crissy's life, who has been through some trauma. And so as we close out this podcast, I want to say that you are so loved, seen, heard, valued, and known. And I say that on every podcast, but I want you to remember that. And so we will be back here in the Healing Zone in 2 weeks, bringing up the Enneagram Type 8. And so I look forward to joining you then. As always, thank you for your time. As I mentioned, that is not something we're making more of. And so as Phil Baker's song plays us out of the podcast, I cannot think of a person that reminds me more of a life marked by Jesus than my friend Angie D. And so thank you for being here with us today. Mm-hmm. Thank you for being here with us, and we will be back next week, or in 2 weeks, correct?
In 2 weeks. Awesome.
All right. Well, thank you guys, and we will see you later.
Let my life glorify you and teach me to walk beside you.